morning, everyone. Let me call this hearing of the Budget Committee to order. Before we get to our opening statements from me and from Ranking Member Grassley, I'd like to take a moment to correct the record from previous hearings regarding the International Monetary Fund's 2021 working paper showing trillions of dollars in global fossil fuel subsidies. At two previous hearings of this committee, minority witnesses challenged that report and estimate that fossil fuel subsidy in the United States is over $600 billion per year. One Republican witness called the report garbage and challenged the legitimacy of including indirect subsidies. This obviously suits the fossil fuel industry, but it is not correct market theory. Economists as conservative as Milton Friedman and Republican witnesses in these hearings have recognized that negative externalities should be in the price of a product and that to shift that cost to the public is a subsidy. A second witness claimed that the IMF paper, and I'm quoting her here, did not represent the view of the IMF. And she asserted that it had not been peer-reviewed. She perhaps did not know that we had a briefing scheduled with Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF. All members of the committee were invited to that briefing. No Republicans attended, so I will report. We asked Ms. Georgieva whether the report represented the official view of the IMF, including with respect to its inclusion of externalities in the subsidy figure. She said, yes, of course it was. We asked about peer review. She told us that the methodology of these reports out of the IMF, which occur regularly, the methodology of these reports was peer-reviewed, and that it made no sense to re-peer review each regular report that was prepared using the peer-reviewed methodology. So to be clear, the IMF report is considered official by the IMF, and was prepared using peer-reviewed methodology. I will leave it to members to reach their own conclusions as to the honesty of testimony that the IMF reports were unofficial and not peer-reviewed. With that cleared up, I turn to my opening statement. Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee, welcome to the 14th hearing of the Senate Budget Committee. In previous hearings, we have addressed multiple serious systemic risks to our economy and to the federal budget caused by carbon pollution. Many of our first 13 hearings made up a series on the economic toll of a changing climate. Today, we explore the insidious role that secretive fossil fuel money has played in exposing us to those forecast economic and budgetary catastrophes. Decades of climate disinformation and obstruction kept the fossil fuel industry benefiting from its $600 billion plus annual subsidy. And it drove up climate-related costs to the federal budget and to the broader economy. The dangers that responsible experts have come to this committee to warn about are actually occurring. Sea levels are rising and wildfires are intensifying, as we saw with the smoke a couple of weeks ago. Insurers are fleeing high-risk coastal and wildfire areas as predicted. The fossil fuel industry's disinformation campaign has penetrated right into this committee room via witnesses from organizations like the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which through 2021 have collectively received over $500 million $500 million from fossil fuel-related interests. And that's only the money that we know about. We're here today because fossil fuel-funded climate disinformation and obstruction is directly causing systemic financial risks to the economy and to the federal budget. Our witnesses will help us better understand how the fossil fuel industry has corrupted public and legislative understanding of climate change and poisoned our ability to head off these enumerated dangers. There is actually a scientific field of study examining this climate denial phenomenon. We will hear from a professor who has literally written the book on it, from a former PR executive turned documentary film producer who can speak directly to the tactics of disinformation, and from a Bush administration ethics lawyer who has firsthand experience with the effects of corporate money on governance. Fossil fuel disinformation is nothing new. The industry has been at it for decades. Beginning as early as the 1950s, industry scientists became aware of climate change, measuring and predicting it decades before it became a public issue. They knew their products were responsible for it. In 1977, Exxon senior scientist James Black told Exxon's management committee, and I quote, "There is general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels." That's Exxon's senior scientist to Exxon's management. But industry management and CEOs spent decades promoting climate misinformation. By the late 1980s and 1990s, when the general public first became aware of the looming climate threat, Congress pursued bipartisan legislation that would have addressed climate change. The late Senator John McCain ran for president as a Republican on a strong climate platform. Big oil and gas responded with billions of dollars in fossil fuel-funded disinformation, lobbying, and election spending. I lived this. I worked on bipartisan climate legislation from 2007 through 2009. Until in January 2010, the Citizens United decision set loose unlimited political spending by the fossil fuel industry. Worse, the decision allowed that spending to be anonymous. The fossil fuel industry was ready, not only with unlimited dark money, but also with the secret threats and promises that unlimited dark money permits. And it immediately snuffed out bipartisanship on serious climate legislation. It's been a big operation. Collectively, fossil fuel-aligned trade organizations and dark money groups have spent tens of billions of dollars, again, just that we know of, on ads, lobbying, campaign contributions, and dark money front groups. The delay in action that those billions bought directly caused the economic perils that our hearings have spotlighted. Fossil fuel spending has done direct damage to our nation's fiscal future, not just to our environment. Lawsuits abound against major oil and gas corporations for deceiving the public about the climate damages that they knew their products would cause. The House Oversight Committee started its own investigation into fossil fuel deception, an investigation I intend to see through, to hold accountable the players in industries spreading the disinformation that will rock the very foundations of our economic well-being. We will pay a terrible economic and human price if the campaign is not exposed and disabled. With that, I'll turn this over to my distinguished ranking member, Senator Grassley, for his opening remarks. And I went a minute over, so feel free to go a minute over, Senator Grassley.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today marks the 10th hearing on climate change at the Budget Committee and our 14th missed opportunity to work together on a responsible budget, all for the sake of the American people. We're once again here to discuss an alleged scheme involving fossil fuel overlords, from the banks to the insurance companies to those they call friends on my side of the aisle, Democrats accuse those they disagree with of wrongdoing. They equate a simple difference of opinion to collusion and, of course, to corruption. This is not the type of discussion that encourages bipartisanship or promotes the development of valuable legislation. It's a perfect example of why Congress has deteriorated since I came here many years ago, and it's contributed to the extreme division within our society today. Throughout these climate hearings, Democrats have claimed that climate change will cause catastrophic economic collapse due to devastating natural disasters. They've also attributed a Republican rejection of extreme climate policy to an alleged fossil fuel disinformation conspiracy to defraud the public. This premise either insults the integrity or the intelligence of Republican legislators that diligently serve their constituents as well as our constituents. Not only does it assume catastrophe without clear scientific backing, but also it ignores the simple fact that most Americans don't want expensive and burdensome climate regulations, but Democrats think that you're too dumb to think for yourselves. They somehow think that all knowledge resides here in Washington, D.C., when in fact, Washington is an island surrounded by reality. Democrats argue that Americans only despise top-down climate policy because of disinformation. They think Americans have been easily fooled into rejecting the Democrat narrative of climate destruction. I don't agree, and most Americans don't either. Iowans can clearly see that President Biden's war on fossil fuels has been disastrous for our economy and terrible for consumers. Remember $5 gas last year? I've always said that sunlight is the best disinfectant when it comes to the people's business. But for sunlight to work, it needs to shine more than in just politically convenient places. We've heard apocalyptic claims and alarming statistics in these climate hearings, but we've yet to have a real conversation about the source of these assertions because it doesn't help the Democrat agenda. The Congress has had multiple hearings regarding so-called dark money, but I've yet to hear a clear definition of what dark money is. Since Democrats receive much more secret or dark money than Republicans, it's clearly a partisan definition. So we get to today. I'm looking forward to hearing Mr. Walter's explanation of this Democratic disinformation strategy. He's been the president of Capital Research Center for 7 years, an investigative think tank that connects the dots between left-wing politicians, lobbying groups, labor unions, foundations, and other nonprofits. If we're going to discuss climate disinformation, it seems to me that we should take a balanced and analytical approach. This means we must first affirm the validity of information, what the science actually says, before making a claim of disinformation. Objective climate scientists are best suited to do this, which is why I'm excited to welcome Dr. Pelkey, the only climate scientist on the panel. Dr. Pelkey is a professor of environmental studies at the University of Colorado, teaching and writing on the intersection of climate and politics. Prior to his 22 years at Colorado, he was a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I'm confident that he will shed much needed science-driven light upon real climate disinformation. I would also like to welcome the Democratic witnesses who come from a diverse array of non-climate science backgrounds to testify on climate disinformation. One is a filmmaker, another a historian, and the latter a Democratic farmer labor politician. I look forward to listening to their testimonies and hope that they'll be even-handed in their assessments and forthright about their professional relationships with dark money groups. We've seen Democratic witnesses who've been receiving funding from secret dark money groups. It would behoove all of us to be honest about the prevalence of so-called dark money on both sides of the aisle. I yield.
We have 5 witnesses today. First, we have Dr. Naomi Oreskes. She is the Henry Charles Lee Professor of the History of Science and Affiliated Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University. Dr. Oreskes is the author or co-author of 9 books and over 150 articles, essays, and opinion pieces, and her best-selling book, Merchants of Doubt, studied how and to what extent large industries manufacture doubt about the state of the science for their own benefit. Dr. Oreskes, thank you for being here. Our second witness is Christine Arena. She is the founder and producer at Generous Films, an award-winning production company that brings cinematic storytelling to the social impact space. Before that, however, she was a 20-year veteran of the communications industry and served as executive vice president at the public relations firm Edelman. Thank you, Ms. Arena, for bringing that experience here to share today. Next, we have Richard Painter, the S. Walter Ritchie Professor of Corporate Law at the University of Minnesota Law School and former Associate Counsel to the President in the White House Counsel's Office as the Chief Ethics Lawyer to President George W. Bush. He was previously a board member and vice chair of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, as well as a founding board member of Take Back Our Republic, a campaign finance reform organization. Mr. Painter, we welcome you as well. Our fourth witness is Dr. Roger Pielke. He has been on the faculty of the University of Colorado Boulder since 2001, where he teaches and writes on a diverse range of policy and governance issues related to science, technology, environment, innovation, and sports. He has served as a science and economics advisor to Environmental Progress, that's a capitalized proper name, since 2019. Thank you for being here. Finally, we have Scott Walter, the president of Capital Research Center. He previously served in the George W. Bush administration as special assistant to the president for domestic policy. I wonder if you guys ever ran into each other in the Bush White House. He was a senior fellow at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, and he was senior editor of the American Enterprise Institute's flagship publication. Thank you also for being here. And Dr. Oreskes, if we may begin with your testimony, you each have 5 minutes to make your statements, and your complete testimony will be made a part of the record of this hearing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator, and thank you, members. It's an honor to be with you here today. In March 1969, the U.S. Senator from Washington State, Henry Scoop Jackson, received a letter from an angry constituent. The man had watched an episode of a popular television show where the beat poet, Allen Ginsberg, told an alarming story of planetary demise. Ginsberg claimed that, quote, the current rate of air pollution brought about by automobiles could cause the rapid buildup of heat on Earth, which would melt the polar ice caps, causing a flooding of the greater part of the globe. The constituent wanted the senator to stop the kooky poet from spouting such irresponsible nonsense. After all, he wrote, quite a few million people watch this show. Senator Jackson forwarded the letter to Richard Nixon's science advisor, Lee Dubridge, asking for clarification. Dubridge replied with a long letter affirming that Ginsberg was basically correct. We were indeed filling the atmosphere with a great many gases and in very large quantities from the burning of fossil fuels, he wrote, which could indeed warm the planet and melt the ice caps. Were the scientists who raised this concern being alarmist? Dubridge didn't think so. Quote, I don't like to be a calamity howler, he said, but sometimes it takes a few calamity howlers to arouse people to the point where they are willing to do something. I think we are at that point now. Over the next decade, scientists faced little resistance as they published scores of scientific papers and reports on the threat of man-made climate change. Things changed, however, in the 1980s when a scientific consensus began to emerge that anthropogenic climate change was no longer a prediction, but a fact. When Vice President George H.W. Bush ran for president in 1988, he promised that if elected president, he would bring the power of the Whitehouse effect to fight the greenhouse effect. In 1992, world leaders, including now President Bush, convened in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to sign the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, promising to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. We had a scientific consensus. We had political will. The year was 1992, so why didn't we act? A major part of the answer, as I have documented now in numerous books, papers, and reports, involves the role of ExxonMobil Corporation in disparaging climate science and the broader role of corporate America in denying market failure. I'd like to bring your attention to this illustration. In the late 1980s, ExxonMobil turned from information to disinformation. In various venues, the company claimed or insinuated that there was no consensus among scientific experts and that the underlying science was too uncertain to warrant action. The graph shown here presents an analysis undertaken by Exxon's own scientists in 1982, in which they forecast future levels of atmospheric CO2 and the mean global temperature that would ensue from that. The black lines are ExxonMobil's projections. The red and blue lines we have added to show what actually happened in the real world. And you can see that the Exxon projections were extremely accurate. In fact, they actually thought it would be slightly worse than it's turned out to be. Exxon knew what would happen. But in public, starting in the 1990s and continuing for decades, company executives disparaged climate science, particularly climate models. In 2015, for example, CEO Rex Tillerson said, "We do not really know what the climate effects of 600 parts per million versus 400 parts per million will be." But if we look at my second diagram here, whoops, I could use some help. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. We've added these arrows to highlight what, in fact, ExxonMobil's own projections showed, and we see that 600 parts per million produces 1.3 degrees centigrade, so more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit, more warming than 400 degrees, and it pushes the total warming well above the 2-degree threshold that climate scientists had concluded would be dangerous interference. Now, ExxonMobil's disparagement of climate science was part of a larger corporate narrative, which I don't have time to discuss in detail today, but which Eric Conway and I have documented in our new book, The Big Myth, that denied the reality of market failure. The reality is that markets do fail, and climate change is a massive market failure. As you heard from the chair, the International Monetary Fund estimates that the unpaid damages from using fossil fuels are, quote, a staggering $5.2 trillion, or 6.5% of global GDP every year. Now, these costs are not just measured in money. They are measured in illness, in suffering, and above all, in lives. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in 2021, the heat dome that affected the U.S. Pacific Northwest caused over 250 deaths in Oregon, in Idaho, in Washington, and in Alaska. Scientists have concluded that the occurrence of a heat wave of that severity in that region was, quote, virtually impossible without human-caused claim. 54 years have passed since presidential science advisor Lee Dubridge explained the greenhouse effect to Senator Henry Jackson. During that time, the fossil fuel industry and its allies have spent billions of dollars in false advertising, misleading marketing, and lobbying designed to confuse the American people about the scientific facts of climate change and to prevent the adoption of meaningful solution. Their lies have cost trillions of dollars in damages. Their lies have cost lives. Thank you.
Ms. Arena, please proceed with your statement.
Thank you. Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, it's an honor to be with you today. As Chairman Whitehouse indicated, I have 20 years of experience in the communications industry, and I am also an author and researcher on greenwashing, a tactic I will discuss shortly. Disinformation is not a matter of differing opinion. It is the deliberate dissemination of false or misleading rhetoric that is spread for profit or political gain. In the hands of industries that make lethal products, including cigarettes, opioids, and fossil fuels, disinformation strategies have led to decades of delay on important policy issues and resulted in immense costs to society. Modern disinformation campaigns do not merely seek to convince people that something true is false or that something false is true. Their aim is to erode the very basis for discerning between empirical fact, expert knowledge, and industry propaganda. They seek to undermine people's ability to calculate risk and make informed decisions, leading to mass confusion and a lack of political will. In recent years, we have witnessed a striking evolution of the methods used to deceive people about the harmful effects of fossil fuels. While climate disinformation rhetoric has become more manipulative and divisive, it has also become more pervasive, thanks to the power of digital technology and the billions of dollars that fossil fuel interests spend each year to ensure that society remains hooked on oil and gas. My written statement outlines a series of blatantly deceptive and obstructive methods, from the mass marketing of false climate solutions and net zero commitments to the capture of critical climate negotiations like COP. It illustrates how fossil fuel money is linked to the deployment of hundreds of front groups across the country, as well as sophisticated bot networks, fake social media accounts, and hacking operations targeting climate activists. It describes the tactics used by fossil fuel corporations and trade associations to block climate action, including, number one, greenwashing, or the purposeful production of false positive perceptions of a company or industry's environmental performance. Number two, astroturfing. Those are activities creating the illusion of community support for a corporate position without concealing who is really paying for them. Number three, flooding. That refers to the production of online noise and concentrated ad placements to disorient people and drown out opposing viewpoints. And number four, infiltration, a strategy using financial influence to manipulate, among other things, the climate research from renowned academic institutions including Harvard, Stanford, MIT, among others. Collectively, these tactics make it almost impossible for legitimate climate scientists to be heard over industry voices, for well-intentioned consumers to make informed choices, and for concerned lawmakers, including members of this committee, to take the necessary steps to protect their constituents. Fossil fuel companies and interests are not engaging in disinformation solely in order to sell more products. They are using these tactics in bad faith to interfere with matters of policy. For this reason, more than any other, the American public has a right to know the truth. Citizens deserve to know who is organizing and funding AstroTurf campaigns. Investors deserve to know their financial exposure to climate risks. Consumers deserve to know the health-related consequences of breathing fossil fuel-polluted air, as well as the economic and environmental risks of prolonged fossil fuel reliance. They deserve to know that in the absence of accountability from the fossil fuel industry, they are the ones who pay for climate havoc, whether through rising insurance costs, loss of coverage, loss of property, or even loss of life. Without complete, candid disclosure, there is no freedom of choice. The majority of my industry supports a principle outlined by the Institute for Advertising Ethics that as professional communicators, we share a common objective of honesty, transparency, and high ethical standards in serving the public. In my view, the majority of current fossil fuel industry communications do not comply with these standards. I will end my testimony by noting that despite ample demonstrable evidence to the contrary, U.S. fossil fuel executives maintain and have always maintained that they have never deliberately misled the public. What that tells us is not that they are blameless, but that they will never alter course without being legally compelled to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Painter, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, for inviting me here today. I have been in public law school teaching for 30 years, since 1993, at the University of Oregon, the University of Illinois, and since 2007, the University of Minnesota. I was proud to serve as the chief Whitehouse ethics lawyer for President George W. Bush from 2005 to 2007. I am a political independent. In Minnesota, we are allowed to vote in either Republican or Democratic primary. We do not have to register for parties. We are allowed to run for office in either party, regardless of our prior or current party affiliation. I ran as in the Democratic Farmer Labor Party primaries in 2018 and again for Congress in 2022 with a strong environmental platform, with the strong support of the former Republican governor of Minnesota, Arne Hedge Carlson. I've worked a lot with Arne Carlson and others of both political parties and many independents, such as myself, on clean water issues in Minnesota, protecting the environment. This is not a partisan issue. This is not about being a Democrat or Republican or an independent. This is about caring and doing something about a grave threat to the human race. And I'm here to testify about the intersection between two calamities. One, climate change, which if we do not confront, will lead to catastrophe. And second, the role of money in politics. I am not a climate scientist. I will defer to the scientists on this panel and to scientists around the country on the question of climate change, the role of fossil fuels, and CO2 emissions. But I will speak now about the role of money in politics, which is very, very relevant to this conversation. And once again, it's not a partisan issue. I've looked at the role of money in politics going back to the time of the American Revolution, when the East India Company corrupted Parliament and Tea Party patriots threw the tea into Boston Harbor to let them know what we thought of corporate money in politics and taxation without representation of the people. I have studied the role of corporate money in politics in the United States in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. I've looked at what happened during the Reagan, Clinton, Bush years, through the Obama years, up through the Trump and Biden administrations. Money corrupts our government. This is not a partisan issue. It was bad when I was in the Bush White House. I saw the influence of campaign contributors in both political parties. President Bush signed into law the McCain-Feingold Act, which would try to restrict some of that, however ineffectively. I wrote a book in 2008 called Getting the Government America Deserves, on how the campaign money ultimately was undermining government ethics across the board, and that was before Citizens United, when the United States Supreme Court opened the floodgates of dark money in politics by striking down critical portions of the campaign finance reforms in the McCain-Feingold Act on a fundamentally flawed assumption, a theory. And I will emphasize that in the law, nothing has been more pernicious in law than abstract theories untethered from reality. And the abstract theory underlying the Citizens United case is that corporations are people, just like the rest of us, that transactions, flows of money from one bank account to another into an electioneering communication organization, whether it's Citizens United or any other, or into a super PAC, that's the same thing as a citizen standing on a soapbox delivering a speech. Completely untethered from reality. And the flood of money into both political parties is destroying our democracy and, yes, is making it much harder for us to fight climate change, to come together, to come up with solutions to this problem, instead of calling each other names, instead of always pointing the finger at someone else, instead of saying, what can I do about this problem? And that's why we're here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Painter. Dr. Pilkey.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Grassley. It's a privilege to testify today. In 2015, following testimony I delivered before the House and the Senate, summarizing the consensus conclusions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, a member of Congress demanded that I be investigated by my university. He suggested that I may have been receiving undisclosed funding from fossil fuel companies. My university complied. The results of the investigation were, of course, not surprising to me. I was not the recipient of any fossil fuel funding from any fossil fuel interest and never had been. However, the very public accusation was enough to derail my work and upend my career in ways that continue today. One important role of us experts is to call things as we see them. Sometimes research results are inconvenient or uncomfortable to certain interests, and that includes political interests. Please know that I call things like I see them. No one is paying me to express certain views. My written testimony discusses 4 take-home points, which I will briefly summarize. First, human-caused climate change is real. It poses significant risks to society and the environment, and both mitigation and adaptation policies are necessary and make good sense. Second, the best and likely the only antidote to misinformation is accurate information. Successfully producing, communicating, legitimizing, and trusting accurate information to inform policy requires upholding standards of scientific integrity. Today, there is general agreement that our current media environment and political discourse are rife with misinformation. In my areas of expertise, this is certainly the case. The U.S. Congress has long recognized the importance of scientific integrity. On climate, in 1990, Congress established an advisory mechanism in the form of a national climate assessment. However, locating the National Climate Assessment within the Executive Office of the President has made it a tempting target for political meddling under both Democratic and Republican presidents. Third, in important areas of climate science, the self-correcting function of science has short-circuited. The persistent misuse of climate scenarios, one area where I research, is perhaps the most pervasive and consequential example of climate misinformation today. If there's just one sentence you take from my testimony today, it is this: you are currently being misinformed. Scenarios are inputs to projections of future changes in climate, its impacts on society and the environment, and the consequences and costs of alternative policy actions. However, the scenarios that are currently prioritized in climate research, assessment, and policy are badly outdated. Carbon dioxide emissions in the real world are already at a level far less than projected in the most commonly used climate scenarios, and that gap between scenario assumptions and reality is only getting wider. Specifically, the most commonly used climate scenario is called RCP 8.5, which according to the IPCC represents a global temperature increase in 2100 of 4.8 degrees Celsius. RCP 8.5 projects that all global energy consumption will come from coal. That is obviously wrong. The real world is actually tracking below what is called an RCP 4.5 scenario, which represents a 2100 global temperature increase of 2.9 degrees Celsius. This matters because important policy guidance relies on these outdated scenarios. For example, the 2022 White House paper titled Climate Risk Exposure: An Assessment of the Federal Government's Financial Risks to Climate Change use the RCP 8.5 scenario to represent where we're heading, the RCP 4.5 scenario to represent successful climate policy, and the difference between the two to represent the benefits of mitigation. All of this is wrong. Eliminating misinformation is difficult. For instance, a widely cited 2020 paper defending the use of the most extreme RCP 8.5 climate scenario is notable because its authors failed to disclose a financial conflict of interest. They were funded by a major global consultancy that relies heavily on RCP 8.5 in its business promotion and services. So far in 2023, about a dozen studies are published every single day using the outdated RCP 8.5 scenario, according to Google Scholar. Misinformation has powerful momentum. Fourth and finally, concerns expressed about misinformation are sometimes weaponized. One reason for this is that climate change is now big business. That means it is essential that everyone follow well-established standards of scientific integrity. And this includes those funded by fossil fuel interests, renewable energy interests, and in fact, all financial interests. Partisans may believe that the rules apply only to their opponents. They may argue over which side is worse. However, bringing accurate information into the policy process means that principles of scientific integrity must be applied to everyone. Congress has an important role to play in ensuring the integrity of science. Effective policymaking depends on it. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor. We'll now turn to Mr. Walter.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the honor of testifying. I'm president of the Capital Research Center, and we've studied political money debates for decades, including, of course, Mr. Chairman, your speeches and writings. Dark money isn't really mysterious, unless you count that rumor that Leonard Leo invented dark money in a lab in Wuhan. No, to say that a group uses dark money is like saying the group uses telephones. It's a universal technology. Oddly, the people who most often use the term never define it with legal precision, even when they're speaking in a Judiciary Committee hearing or a Senate Finance hearing, where that would seem necessary. But if you're trying to scare others with a boogeyman, best to keep the monster's outline shadowy. Now, if dark money be a monster, it's not a large one. The biggest number I can find is OpenSecret's $1 billion in 2020, which sounds big until you see OpenSecret's number for the hard dollars disclosed to the FEC, which makes the dark money boogeyman about 7% of election spending. So, dark money is universal in politics and not a large part of politics. But dark money is not equally, or if I were a man of the left, I'd say fairly, distributed. It tilts strongly toward the Democratic Party. A few simple stats. OpenSecret's totals for dark money in the 2020 election show almost a 2.5 to 1 advantage for the Democrats. In just the presidential race, Mr. Biden enjoyed 6 times the dark money of his opponent. The Democrats had a dark money advantage in the 2022 cycle, 2020, 2018. Here's another example. Mr. Chairman, the conservative judicial activist you especially target received in 2021 a $1.65 billion donation to a C4 dark money group. But just weeks after that story broke, a left-wing billionaire gave about twice that amount to a dark money group on the left. A better comparison for that $1.65 billion is the money raked in by the left's biggest nonprofit network, the Empire run by Arabella Advisors. It raised almost exactly the same amount the same year. The year before, it raised $1.7 billion. So what the chairman's special target enjoyed as a once-in-a-lifetime windfall is just the yearly take for Arabella. Again, I'm arguing C4 dark money is not a big deal in American politics. But if anyone insists it pollutes our politics, then the big polluter is the Democratic Party, and the strongest drivers of big pollution are environmentalists. For instance, the Arabella Network was founded by environmentalist Derek Kessler, who's deeply tied as well to the Dark Money League of Conservation Voters, which is both the biggest source of campaign contributions to the chairman and also, quote, a dark money heavyweight, says the Center for Public Integrity. Another strong environmentalist tie at Arabella, the Sierra Club helped launch Arabella's 1630 Fund, quote, the indisputable heavyweight of Democratic dark money, says The Atlantic. Arabella's environmentalist ties do have an unusual and especially disturbing feature, foreign dark money. One of Arabella's top donors for 2 decades is the environmentalist Hans-Jörg Wyss, a foreign national who's admitted violating bans on foreign money in American politics in the past and now funds Arabella's network to influence our politics. Still, dark money and all money in politics is simple. People who believe in causes raise money for those causes, start groups for those causes, collaborate with each other, buy ads to persuade the public, support their champions, criticize their opponents. When the chairman takes money from the League of Conservation Voters, that doesn't mean the League has captured him. It means they agree with him. The people on the other side of the issues operate the same way, using the same kind of, but a lot less, of various types of political money. So to act outraged that somebody is using dark money reveals the real definition of dark money. Support for speech the left wants to silence. Trying to silence one's opponents is the opposite of democracy, but it's understandable given how unpopular some of the left's, especially environmentalists, agenda items are. The ESG movement, for example, funded with millions from billionaires like George Soros and millions from the Arabella Network, is currently trying to have banks stop loans to any company related to fossil fuels, which would mean Americans couldn't buy gas for their cars and trucks and might have an effect on the federal budget. Trying to stifle speech with the boogeyman of dark money drives debate away from the substance of issues to issues of money. I urge the committee instead to focus on the substance of issues, like climate change. Thank you.
Thanks very much. The ranking member has stepped out for a second, but I'm going to go ahead and proceed with my questions. Ms. Orskes, let me go back to the quote about the threat of climate change that you use in your testimony. Sometimes it takes a few calamity howlers to wake people up to the fact that there are serious problems and to arouse people to the point where they're willing to do something about it. I think we are at that point now. Again, who said that?
Lee Dubridge, the science advisor to President Richard Nixon in 1969.
Thank you. You are involved in the study of the fossil fuel disinformation campaign and have been for many years. You are not alone. Could you describe for us the academic study of the fossil fuel disinformation operation, how roughly many scientists are engaged in it, how robust the science is on this subject, and why don't you answer that first, and then I'll ask the second part of the question.
And thank you for that question, and thank you also for the opportunity to set the record straight about my own qualifications. So I'm trained as an earth scientist. I have a PhD from the School of Earth Sciences at Stanford University, and as you noted at the outset, I'm also an affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University, and I have published numerous papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals on climate science, particularly on the statistics of temperature records, because I have formal training in statistics. Today I am employed, like Roger, as a social scientist, but I consider that to be a form of science. And so I didn't start out to work in this area. My work is in the history of science. I'm interested in the development of scientific knowledge. And I was studying the development of climate science knowledge as a scientific question, and I was doing that work in the early 2000s when there was not really a scientific field of studying this question of disinformation. It became clear to me from my historical research that the scientific evidence for the reality and potential severity of man-made climate change was very deep, that it went back.
My question is more about the disinformation
campaign than
about the climate change. So if you could focus on that in the short time I have.
Sure, I'll try. Thank you. Sorry for that. So I published a paper in 2004 called The Scientific Consensus on Climate Change, where I documented this consensus. As a result of that paper, I became a target of the disinformation campaign. I started getting hate mail. I had people file complaints against me at my university and went through some unpleasant experiences as well.
And you're not alone in that. People like Michael Mann have also been the subject of
correct.
Fossil fuel
What I learned as I started to investigate that I was not alone, and that in fact there was a network of people who were attacking climate scientists like Ben Santer, like Michael Mann, and like myself. And so that experience of being attacked led me to try to understand what these attacks were, who was funding them, who was behind them, and why they were doing it. And over...
So as a scientist, how would you describe the state of the science that looks at the climate disinformation campaign as a phenomenon? Is it just in its nascent stage? Is it fairly robust? Is there a scientific consensus? Is it passing peer review? What are the markers of how real it all is?
So I'd say that the field is mature now. So it was nascent in the early 2000s. It's been around for about 20 years now. We're academics. We mostly publish in peer-reviewed scientific literature, although we also publish books and opinion pieces. I'd say it's a well-developed network now of academics, both in the United States and elsewhere, and there are now many scores of academic researchers who study this as an empirical problem, as a scientific problem.
Let me shift to Ms. Arena for a moment. Your testimony makes comparisons between the tobacco industry's campaign of fraud and what the fossil fuel industry is doing these days. Could you elaborate a little bit on that comparison between the tobacco campaign to deny the dangers of its product and the fossil fuel campaign to deny the dangers of its product?
Sure, there are many parallels. First and foremost, the denial that the products in question are dangerous to people, the denial of the science. For the tobacco industry, as Dr. Orskes knows better than I, that was a 50-year campaign For fossil fuels, it took a very long time before corporations acknowledged the reality of climate change, let alone acknowledge that it was human-driven, let alone acknowledge that it was the burning of fossil fuels that is primarily responsible for that climate change. Second, tobacco companies really took advantage of the opportunity to market filtered and light cigarettes, to almost seizing the lung cancer link as a business opportunity. And we do see fossil fuel companies doing something very similar with carbon capture technology, with other green solutions that they tried to market, in a sense, defending their core business model. Now, I'm not saying carbon capture should not be scaled. It absolutely should. But really, we see
You're
a lot
talking
of...
as an expert on marketing, and you're talking about the marketing campaign.
Exactly. And so we see a similar marketing tactics and a similar denial approach, attacking science, then questioning the science, then hiring their own experts, and then really taking advantage of market opportunities.
Ranking Member Grassley.
I have a point of personal privilege before I start my questioning. I want you to know that Senator Johnson and I were accused of spreading Russian disinformation for 2.5 years, and everybody now knows that we were not spreading Russian disinformation on an investigation that we were doing. Dr. Pelkey, you were fired from your position at 538. WikiLeaks later revealed an explicit campaign against you. The editor of Think Progress, a website that's part of the lobbying arm of a far left-wing Center for American Progress, wrote the following in an email to billionaire dark money Democrat donor Tom Steyer. Quote, I think it's fair to say that without Climate Progress, the environmental arm of Think Progress, Pilkey would still be writing on climate change for 538. Why do you believe you were fired from 538 and smeared in the media?
Yeah, thank you. I had written a piece. I was hired by Nate Silver to write for 538, and since climate change was so contested, I said, well, if you let me write some about sports, I'll also write about climate change. My first piece was to summarize an IPCC report. In 2012, the IPCC released a report, a special report on extreme events, and it was straight up IPCC consensus science that I wrote about. What I said in that piece was that disaster costs are increasing, but they're increasing because we have more stuff, more property, more buildings in harm's way. That's what the IPCC concluded. There was an organized campaign released years later, and you never know where you'll find yourself. I was in the WikiLeaks. And it was organized by Center for American Progress along with a climate scientist named Michael Mann. And they were very explicit why they wanted me to be removed. My message, even though it was on consensus science, was not politically comfortable or acceptable. So it was a very clear reason why I was attacked. My only regret is that the editors at 538 didn't stand firm and say we're going to support strong science.
Mr. Walter, witnesses called to testify before this committee this year by the majority work for organizations that have received dark money from Arabella Advisors. The president of the Niskanen Center even admitted on the record to receiving funding from anonymous donors in the past, but in 10 climate hearings, Democrats have never asked a single one of their witnesses about their receipts of dark money, let alone attempted to impugn the integrity or accuse them of conspiracy. Why do you think that is, and how does Arabella Advisors influence Democratic legislators, and why is the Democratic dark money conveniently ignored by the left?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I can't explain exactly why your colleagues aren't willing to look at the dark money ties of their own witnesses, because, of course, they're very extensive, and influencewatch.org, our website, would provide lots of information on that. Arabella is a stunningly powerful. It affects the executive branch, it affects regulations, it affects legislation, with, as I said, billions of dollars a year, some of it from foreign donors. Now, one of my favorite examples of this would be that almost the entire Biden regulatory agenda has been shaped by an especially dark bit of Arabella called Governing for Impact. And interestingly, that has ties to a witness that appeared at the last hearing where I had the honor of testifying to Chairman Whitehouse.
Are any Democratic witnesses on this panel linked to the web of liberal dark money donations?
Yes, just today you have a witness, for instance, who spent years at the group called Crew, which is tied to the dark money of Empire of David Brock and other dark money. You have a witness who's connected to a nonprofit that receives money from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is one of the donors tied up in the Arabella Network.
Dr. Orzesky, the environmental law firm Scher Edling receives funding by way of the Resource Legal Fund and the Arabella Advisors New Venture Fund from foreign and domestic elites to promote progressive climate policies. Democratic dark money giant George Soros and Leonard DiCaprio are among their donors. Are you currently or have you ever been retained by the environmental law firm Scher Edling?
Opportunity to talk about the case that I consulted on, San Mateo versus Chevron, where the people of San Mateo County have sued for redress because of the damages that that county and the state of California is experiencing from sea level rise caused by climate change caused by their product, oil and gas.
My time's up. Thank you.
Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you. Good morning, and thank you very much for this really important hearing. I'd like to just do a little history lesson, Mr. Chairman, and take you back over 100 years ago when Henry Ford and Thomas Edison were building the first automobile, and they wanted to build an affordable electric car. And in 1914, there was an article in the New York Times where they were lamenting the fact that they had challenges developing a battery with enough range. That sounds familiar. Unfortunately, at the same time, in Texas, they were developing oil fields. And we saw just 2 years after this article, Congress passed a change in the tax law to, in effect, provide oil companies interest-free loans. It was the first fossil fuel subsidy. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, for those of us that work on battery and solar and wind and other clean energies, say we shouldn't pick winners and losers. Mr. Chairman, over 100 years ago, we picked a winner and they won for 100 years. And so now we move and we look at the fact that it's no surprise that Henry Ford chose to focus on the technology of the time and developed the internal combustion engine. Now, it's true that my home state of Michigan has benefited from these choices. We put the world on wheels. We are extremely proud of our place in history as we move now to cleaner technologies as well. But I would also say, wouldn't it have been better if we had understood the issues of carbon pollution at the very beginning and had built that in to what was happening? Imagine the difference. Just imagine if we had incentives at the very beginning for battery technology instead of the first fossil fuel subsidy. And imagine if the oil and gas industry had not used their profits in basically every resource to stop efforts to recognize and end carbon pollution or even acknowledge it. Imagine if all of this, Mr. Chairman, had gone into technologies to stop carbon pollution, methane pollution, other greenhouse gases. Imagine what a different world we would have today if all this dark money had gone into a cleaner environment and supporting the realities of science. So the reality is that the climate is changing. We have a climate crisis hitting us over the head every day. I chair the Agriculture Committee. You can't talk to a farmer now that does not acknowledge what is happening. And their long-time efforts and overwhelming financial influence using dark money has cost us precious, precious time. Just last week, we had hail the size of golf balls destroying farms and homes in the small town of Howell, Michigan. And there's story after story of wildfire smoke coming at us, droughts and floods and everything else. And you can tally the total cost in terms of dollars, or you can tally it in terms of lives. Both are at historic levels in terms of loss. In the 2022 saw 18 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters inflicting $175 million in damages and costing 475 people their lives. So, Dr. Oreskes, in your testimony, you talk about these real costs. Can you talk a little bit more about the price everyday folks have to pay for this inaction? I would argue 100 years of inaction on the climate crisis. And can you talk a little bit more about the tactics big oil has been using that has created this situation?
Well, thank you for that question. I'm not an economist, but I do follow the work of my economic colleagues, and we have numerous studies now. This is an area where the science really has advanced and changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Most of the basic science of climate change really hasn't changed that much in the 20 years I've been working on this issue, but the economic analyses and the detection and attribution studies have. So detection and attribution, sometimes called D&A, not DNA, but DNA, refers to analyses that try to answer the question, would this have happened but for climate change, or would it have been as bad? And there have been major advances in that, and we now have scores and scores of scientific studies that prove beyond any reasonable doubt that numerous extreme weather events, floods, wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, hailstorms, they're harder, they're trickier, but almost certainly hailstorms as well. Maybe tornadoes, those are scientifically tricky, but that many of these events have become worse, and in some cases so much worse that scientists could say, as they did about the heat dome, that this would not have happened but for climate change. And as you know, billions of dollars in losses from hurricanes, floods, extreme precipitation events. NOAA tracks these data. I don't have them with me, but I could easily find them. We've seen huge increases, and with all due respect to my good colleague Roger, who I've known for many years, Roger's point about people moving to coastal area is not wrong, but it's incomplete. Because yes, there is more damage in coastal areas because more people live there, but in addition, sea level is rising because of climate change. Storm surge has become worse because of climate change, hurricanes and extreme precipitation, and these cost billions of dollars to the American people, to insurers, to reinsurers, and to the federal government because of federal disaster relief. So yes, this is extremely costly, and yes, it is caused by climate change. And the point of my testimony was to say, we have known this science for a long time. And so if we ask the question, why haven't we acted on this very robust body of rich, deep, sophisticated scientific knowledge? A big part of the answer, it's not the only, but a big part of the answer is because the way the fossil fuel industry and its allies have deliberately set out to undermine our confidence in the science and to make us think that the science wasn't strong enough to warrant action.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Stabenow. To your urge that we imagine, there's a very specific thing we could imagine, which is that if the Republican Chafee-Schneider climate legislation of 1988 had passed, we would be at 282 parts per million carbon dioxide as of 2005. Instead, we're at 418 parts per million today. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Painter pointed out that money corrupts politics. Mr. Pelkey, you talked about climate change as big business. Do you believe also that money can corrupt research?
Yeah, absolutely. I study science and technology policy, and matters of financial conflict of interest are a big deal in the medical sciences, in energy, across the board, and it's important to have standards applied to make sure that conflicts of interest don't warp science one way or another.
Now, I think we've seen, certainly with the pandemic, the fact big pharma funds these studies, they don't release the data. Our federal health agencies aren't transparent. So again, I think this hearing shows that there's big money on both sides of the equation. There's nastiness on both sides, and it's hard to discern the truth. Mr. Walter, did you ever read the book, The New Leviathan, David Horowitz, 2012?
Certainly did.
So in that book, he lays out, just talking about progressive environmental groups versus conservative environmental groups. On the progressive side, again, this is in 2012, there are 553 groups that he identified. On the progressive side, 32 conservative groups. The net assets of the progressive groups was $9.53 billion. The net assets of the conservative environmental groups was $38.2 million. So that's a 249 to 1 advantage. In terms of annual grants, and this is really the main part of his book, the progressive groups, whether it's environmental or whatever progressive group, they utilize their financial wherewithal to impact government, to get government to spend its money on their causes, whereas conservative groups basically just try to spend money on their causes. But the annual grants from progressive groups, $554 million per year spent on progressive, or granted to progressive environmental groups, 1.2 million for conservative groups. That's a 462 to 1 advantage. Is that's kind of what you're talking about with Arabella and the whole issue of dark money. It's really dark money on the left that overwhelms the dark money on the right, correct?
That's absolutely right, Senator. And we did our own studies on this at climatedollars.org, and you can see the enormous left-wing advantage on this. If left-wing policies are not succeeding, it is not because there's big money on the other side.
And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter those facts from 2012 into the record if I could, and I'll provide that information to you. It is interesting in these...
The record will remain open for a week.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll do so.
For you to add whatever you wish.
You know, it's interesting we have these budget hearings, and as Ranking Member Grassley points out, we're really not talking about the budget. We're talking about climate change, which is fine. I'm enjoying them. I've got an open mind. I've never denied climate change. I'm just not a climate change alarmist because climate has always changed. I find it interesting on the majority witnesses, there really aren't very many scientists. We're bringing a few more environmental scientists on the minority, so you can't really get into the discussion on climate change. But I think it's interesting that Dr. Oresky, you say you actually are an earth scientist or something. So here's the questions I have that remain unanswered. Are you familiar with the Vostok ice core sample?
Yes, absolutely.
So that's 400 something. The most famous ice core, about 400 some thousand years of climate history, showing temperatures, average global temperatures at that spot, CO2 concentration, methane. What is you realize we're in about our 5th cycle. Temperature variation of 22.7 degrees. Also, you take a look at the sea level rise in the Bay of San Francisco, 390 feet over the last 10, 20,000 years. What caused that?
Well, the claim that climate has always changed is a claim that we hear all the time from people who are skeptical about climate change.
Well, it's true. I mean,
So let me explain. Let me answer the question. So yes, of course, the climate has always changed, and earth scientists have studied this for literally centuries. But the key point about anthropogenic climate change is that it's different from natural variability. And Lee DuBridge even said that in 1969. How do we know it's different? Because scientists have studied things like the ice cores, and we now see...
Again, you're not answering what caused...
what caused the
22.7 degree, those 5 cycles? What caused
natural variability is
a sea level rise of 390 feet in the Bay of San Francisco? What caused that?
Natural variability is mostly caused by changes in the Earth's orbit. These have been well documented scientifically.
Did that change?
Yes, it changed.
Has that stopped? I mean, have those phenomena stopped?
It has changed because the human contribution has been added on top of it. Think about it this way.
Do you realize the CO2 concentration is a lagging indicator in the Vostok ice core samples?
Right, because we didn't have people putting CO2 into the atmosphere until the last 100 or 150 years. Think of it this way.
CO2 rise actually lagged temperature rise.
I'm trying to answer your question, Mr. Johnson. Natural variability is like a sine curve. It's like a radio wave. It goes up and down. The human forcing function is a linear curve that goes up, up, and up. So if you impose one on the other, what you get is something that looks like this. So the natural variability still exists. The Earth continues to have orbital variations. But in addition, we have added another component. And that component is the human forcing from greenhouse gases mostly produced by the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. And this has been documented in chapter and verse in numerous peer-reviewed scientific reports.
So are India and China going to stop using fossil fuels?
I'm sorry, what?
Will India and China stop
Well,
using,
now you-
quite honestly, will the U.S.?
Well, now you've changed the subject, but that gives
The answer is they won't, and there's nothing
They
we can
would
do
have
about
if
this.
we
We
had
better
followed the
adapt.
UN Framework Convention that President Bush signed in 1992. The whole point of that convention was to bring all the countries in the world on board, but that got derailed because the United States refused to
According to
ratify.
testimony in this committee, we've spent over $6 trillion combating climate change. Probably haven't made a dent in it. We won't make a dent in it. This is a fool's errand we're on, and we're destroying our ability to have the resources to adapt to the climate change that's going to happen whether we do anything or not.
Well, I'm sorry you
Senator-
feel that way, because I think it's a fool errand to think you could ignore what has happened and not see serious consequences for the American people and the American taxpayer.
Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've had this discussion about dark money, and my colleagues have pointed out there's a lot more dark money on the left than the right. What I find interesting is that if you take the assumption that disclosure is, and I think the chairman used the sunlight is the best disinfectant, then we should simply have all political money be disclosed, where it comes from, and the citizens can decide on what impact that has. And we have legislation like that the chairman has sponsored. We voted on it 3 times. And I would invite my colleagues across the aisle to join us in ending dark money on both sides. It's quite interesting that if, in fact, there's more dark money on the left, that it's only one side of the aisle that wants to end dark money. That sounds like a pretty principled position to me in betterment of the integrity of our campaign system. Now, Dr. Oreskes, my understanding is that Exxon worked with public relations firms to have strategies like saying it's committed to the depth and breadth of climate solutions, that it wanted to reframe itself as an energy company rather than a gasoline or fossil fuel company, that increased its favorability by 10%, that it put forward that it's strongly aligned with Paris, all of which is a way of saying, hey, folks, don't pay attention to our massive fossil fuel undertaking. We're somehow a good guy. Is this the basic strategy of Exxon and other major fossil fuel companies?
Yes, it is, and it's what we've sometimes referred to as misdirection, to try to distract attention away from the basic facts into some distracting issue. So it is true that ExxonMobil, Chevron, and other companies, other oil and gas companies, have sometimes spent small amounts of money on renewable energy. Most estimates show that it's less than 2%. But in their advertisements, for example, they're often very much focused on renewable energy, even though 98% of their commitment is the continued development of oil and gas. And we know from the work that's been done by the IPCC and others, the IPCC and scientists have introduced the notion of a carbon budget. It's the idea that there's a certain amount of oil and gas that we can use without essentially derailing the planetary climate. But nearly all of these groups, including the IMF, by the way, have said, and the International Energy Agency, that this would require not developing new resources of oil and gas. We can use a fair amount of what's still existing, but not searching for new oil and gas. And yet ExxonMobil, Chevron, and all of the major oil and gas companies are continuing to explore for and develop new oil and gas reserves that will commit us to burning fossil fuels for 50 years.
I want to turn to that carbon budget idea. The idea is this is how much we can burn before we hit 1.5 degrees, and we're already here, pretty close to it. But there's some space left. But the last analysis I saw said that the amount of carbon already in kind of the affirmed assets of petroleum companies is 200% more than what will take us from here to 1.5 degrees, and it's 40% more than what would take us to 2 degrees. In other words, if we bring out of the ground everything that has already been identified in the reserves, we shoot past 1.5, we shoot past 2 degrees. Is that a fairly accurate presentation?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
And if we keep developing new sources, then essentially what we're doing is we're committing ourselves to a path of warming that goes on for the generations to come to be much more than 1.5 or 2 or even 3 degrees. I come from a state that's burning up with forest fires. We've lost our average snowpack by 20 feet over 90 years, and it's kind of a striking decade-by-decade drop analysis. Our farmers are really hurting as a result of loss of groundwater, which isn't recharged as fast, less spring melt-off, so there's less water, less rain, severe drought. And so I know that for many of my colleagues that say, well, these are speculative studies about what will happen, 50 years from now or something, but the farming, the fishing, and the forestry are being severely impacted in my state right now, just in my lifetime, really within the last 20 years. And so how urgent is it that we really have to get past the kind of the greenwashing or the political messages and act now?
Well, I think it's absolutely urgent, and as I think we've already said today, we've lost 30 years. I mean, President Bush signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, and that's a long time. If we had started working seriously on this problem at that time, we could have developed many of the large-scale energy infrastructures for solar, for wind, for storage, for demand response pricing, many of these solutions that we know work.
And if the U.S. keeps doing new fossil projects, doesn't that essentially give the rest of the world a free pass to say, hey, you already burned much of the carbon budget that has been burned already. Why should we stop our coal or our fossil methane gas or our oil if the U.S. is still doing new infrastructure?
Well, exactly, and that's exactly what China and India are saying.
Thank you.
Senator Kennedy is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks.
Senator Kane.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses here today. Professor Painter, on May 5th of this year, you put out a tweet. You said, I'm going to quote, "There are some things money can't buy. For everything else, there's the Supreme Court." Would you tell me which members of the Supreme Court you believe are bought?
I was particularly concerned at that point when I posted that tweet.
I understand, but if you could, I've got really limited time, and I apologize for interrupting. Just tell me which members of the court you are bought.
I did not think that Justice Clarence Thomas should be failing to disclose his trips on a billionaire's yacht and airplane.
Do you think he's bought?
I believe that there is grave risk.
Do you think he's bought?
I said there is grave risk.
Do you think he's bought?
To the confidence of the American people in our Supreme Court.
Well, if you don't think he's bought, why did you say it?
I said
yes,
that
you said members of the Supreme Court are bought. You're here testifying as an expert for my Democratic friends, and you're saying the members of the Supreme Court are bought?
I said when the American people feel that way, when we have Supreme Court justices
feel that way?
on yachts and in planes of billionaires and not being disclosed.
Anybody besides Justice Thomas you think is bought on the Supreme Court?
I believe that the court needs to clean
Anybody
up
besides
its
Justice
act.
Thomas?
I'm not going to go through each
I mean,
justice.
you tweeted it.
I tweeted the way the American people feel.
Did you mean it when you tweeted it?
And I stand by that tweet. This Supreme Court of the United States needs to clean up its
Let me
act.
ask you a couple others here, because you've on September 17, 2020, you tweeted, "It looks like Putin's favorite senator could lose," referring to Senator Lindsey Graham. Could you tell me your evidence for saying that Senator Graham is President Putin's favorite senator?
I don't recall that tweet and the story.
Well, I've got it. It's
tweeted
right
out.
here. It's right here.
I'm happy to look at the tweet, and I'm happy to write you, explain that. I don't know what that has to do with climate change.
Well, it has to do with your credibility. Did you say, what is your basis for saying that Senator Graham is President Putin's? I mean, have you ever talked to President Putin?
I have not talked to President Putin, and I would be happy to go look at the tweet and look at the story that I tweeted out and what Senator Graham had said in that context. You know, this is something
you say all this stuff. For example, you're here as an expert from my Democratic friends, and you say all this stuff. You called on September 16, 2023, a professor at the University of Chicago, very distinguished professor, Brian Leiter. You called him a racist. Can you explain to me why you think he's a racist?
I remember a series of tweets with him. He's a Marxist who put out a number of statements attacking African Americans and women. And he also was raising money for someone who had called the police on a black student for sleeping in the common room, and now has a wokekkk.com website attacking me.
That's fair enough.
So
fair enough.
I will just say one thing that I learned in high school debate, that when you have no argument, you simply change the subject.
All right. On October 15th of 2020, you said Lindsey Graham is soliciting cash payments in return for voting on a Supreme Court nomination. What evidence, that's a pretty bold statement, Professor. What evidence do you have for alleging that Senator Graham was taking cash in return for one of his votes?
I don't recall that specific tweet,
Here it
but
is,
I
right
do.
Here it
I
is.
do recall. And
Do you think he was taking cash for one of his votes?
I have received campaign.
Do you think he was taking cash for one of his votes?
I'm answering your question, Senator. I have received solicitations from both political parties.
Do you think Lindsey Graham was taking cash for
justice.
one of his votes? It's a simple question,
I have
Professor.
received cash solicitations for cash on my email. And yes, from both political parties in connection with Supreme Court confirmation votes.
Well, I'm out
It's
of time,
wrong.
but let me just say for the record,
It's wrong.
my aunt's Facebook page has more credibility than you do. I could spend the rest of the day reading your quotes where you make allegations against people and you can't defend them.
You've said nothing about climate change. You quoted everybody from a Marxist
Senator
to
Kaine.
all sorts of other people. This has absolutely nothing to do with the topic of the hearing, Senator.
Senator Kaine is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two items that I want to talk about. One, some good news. Mr. Painter, you challenged us at the end of your opening testimony, hey, don't just be finger pointing at each other, get something done. And I do think we have to say this hearing is within the still recent aftermath of two really powerful pieces of legislation that Congress has passed to help us battle climate change, to help the United States become leaders in the battle against climate change. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, a number of my colleagues worked hard on this bill, makes significant investments in all kinds of infrastructure. The nation needs it, but including clean energy infrastructure. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, which was partisan, it passed by one vote in the Senate, also really rockets the United States ahead in climate leadership by promoting investments in clean energy. We've seen the effect of this in Virginia. Virginia was one of the worst states in the country in terms of any embrace of wind or solar, low-carbon energy, at the same time as we were one of the states most vulnerable to sea level rise. But now, in both wind deployment offshore, Virginia is becoming a leader not only in deploying wind offshore, but also in becoming a hub of manufacturing of offshore wind components, good for the economy. But also in the solar space, Virginia has moved from sort of bottom 10 deployment to top 10. So the efforts of disinformationists notwithstanding, it's not like Congress has just basically accepted the disinformation and gridlocked. We've taken action, and we can debate too hot, too cold, just right, more steps to take. I believe we do need to take more steps. But I do think Congress is acting on this, and we're acting on it in a way that is rocketing ahead great American innovation, creating jobs, putting us in a position where we can encourage others to do the same, a global leadership position, and I think that's important. And then the other point I wanted to make was with respect to something that Mr. Walter said in his testimony, because I don't want anybody watching this to be confused or disinformed. you used a phrase that said the left wants to silence. The left wants to silence speech it doesn't like. We're talking about disclosure. We're not talking about silencing anyone. Dr. Pilkey said it's important to know resources can pervert research. And those resources could come from the left or the right or from anywhere or from foreign sources. It could pervert research. And you said it's really important that on research you be able to figure out if there's a conflict of interest. Resources can pervert campaigns. Mr. Painter, you talked about watching it from the George W. Bush administration through and seeing the effect on campaign contributions and dark money perverting campaigns. Research can pervert the reputation of the Supreme Court. When people appearing before the court are hosting members of the court on luxury vacations who then choose not to disclose it, there is a possibility that worries Americans that justice is being perverted. So who would argue that we shouldn't rout out conflicts of interest? And if we can't eliminate them all, at least we can make them transparent so that voters and citizens and legislators and journalists can figure out what's going on. That's why the American public overwhelmingly supports the Disclose Act. If you look at polling, Republican, Independent, Democratic, everybody believes they should have the right to know who's funding campaigns. Even a person who may never go look at the website to determine who's doing it still thinks they have the right to it, and that should they want to, that information should be there for them. And that's why I'll go back to what my colleague, Senator Merkley, was saying. I don't believe for an instant that if you added up the total of dark money, it's a more significant problem on the Democratic side than the Republican side, because all Democrats are very wanting to get rid of dark money because all Democrats support the Disclose Act. And since Mike Castle was defeated in a Republican primary for Senate in Delaware in 2010, I don't think we've had a single Republican member of either the House or the Senate who has been willing to support the Disclose Act. Those who are willing to say, let it all be transparent, are not trying to silence anyone. They're trying to actually provide the best information to everyone, while those who insist upon opacity, insist upon secrecy, resist transparency, they got something to hide. They got something to hide. And so my hope is, I just resonate with what Dr. Pilkey said. We ought to be able to determine, wherever we are, everyday people, journalists, elected official, expert, whether there's a conflict of interest that could threaten the credibility of information that we receive. Everybody ought to be able to determine that. And we get there by doing things like the Disclose Act, and it would be my hope that at some point we would be able to get some Republican votes to back that up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Let me thank the witnesses for a very helpful hearing. I'll make a brief closing statement, if I may, to follow up on what Senator Kaine has said. Senator Kaine is a very able lawyer. I've got to get down to judiciary. Senator Kaine is a very able lawyer, and one of the key features or subtopics, if you will, of this hearing has been the problem of conflicts of interest and how to explore conflicts of interest. Exploring conflicts of interest is how you distinguish in part between a simple difference of opinion and motivated opinion that is paid for and is perhaps not even sincerely held. And I think it's important to recognize the importance of bias and conflict of interest when you're dealing with testimony, whether it's in Congress or whether it's in courtrooms. As Senator Kennedy just said, it has to do with your credibility. And it's important that that be disclosed, because the difference between paid for opinion and real research is a very important thing. Mr. Pilkey has been quite good about this. If I may quote from a Substack, experts monetizing their expert is one important reason why people become experts. But where expertise and financial interests intersect, things can get complicated. That is why there are robust mechanisms in place for the disclosure and mitigation of financial conflicts of interest. All of this is just common sense. Your doctor can't prescribe you drugs from a company that pays him fees. You wouldn't think much of a report on smoking and health from a researcher supported by the tobacco industry. And because we're both lawyers, we also have spent some time in courtrooms. And one thing I can tell my colleagues about a courtroom is that when you have a witness, particularly when you have an expert witness, one of the things you explore in your cross-examination of that witness is their bias, is their conflicts of interest. It is so normal in courtrooms to challenge witnesses on how they're paid and who is paying them that it would be error for a court to refuse to allow the lawyer to conduct that examination. It is as established a principle of trial practice as exists. So let's appreciate that if it's essential in a courtroom for a jury and a judge to be able to test the credibility of a witness by having their conflicts of interest made a matter of record for the judge and jury to see, it is also appropriate for other hearings as well. So with that, Mark, thank you, Mr. Pilkey. I see you're nodding. You want to make your own?
A minute, me and Johnson.
You want to offer?
A minute?
I'll give
one minute for me?
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. You're
So I've
recognized for a closing statement.
I've been listening to this back and forth at this hearing. I've come to the following three conclusions. Despite attempts to observe the obvious, Democrats receive more dark money than Republicans and don't want the public to know it. Secondly, the problem of climate change is worthy of consideration, but these hearings go past consideration. Democrats don't even bring in climate scientists to bring hearing to have conversation about extreme, unrealistic modelings. Democrats want Americans to think that you're, as Americans, too stupid to think up for themselves. Our time was clearly be better spent doing budgetary works in this committee, which I'm fully prepared to do.
Mr. Chairman, just
Senator Johnson is recognized for unusually. We will give him the courtesy of a 1-minute closing statement.
Just a real quick point. Listen, I certainly want disclosure as well, but I think it should be toward candidates, and certainly when it comes to scientific research, conflicts of interest. The issue with the disclosure of donors to groups really was settled by the Supreme Court in the 50s with Alabama versus the NAACP, where Alabama wanted to disclose the donors to the NAACP, and we know why. And that same concern exists today because we've seen individuals being doxxed, we've seen people being attacked for supporting a group that maybe the other side doesn't particularly like. So there is a rationale for donors being able to donate to a cause that they feel strongly about without their donation being disclosed. Okay, so there's a legitimate argument on the other side. I mean, again, I would be pleased with unlimited campaign contributions, full disclosure within 24 hours. That's an appropriate use. Okay, but again, there's funding so many different ways, different organizations, union. It's just not. I know it's a good sounding bill, but it's misguided.
Mr. Chair, 30 seconds.
And none of that. Yes, Senator Kane, we're have your minute too.
I'll take 30 seconds. I don't think you can analogize NAACP members in the Alabama of the 1950s and their need for protection from criminal prosecution to wealthy individuals who want to support often untrue political ads without their name being associated with those untruths. I just challenge that analogy.
As do I. And with that, the hearing is concluded. The members will have a week to add any questions for the record. I would invite Ms. Arena to provide a response to Senator Merkley, because I thought his questioning was much directed to you, if you would care to do that. And if Dr. Oreskes would like, I saw you making some comments during the testimony of some of the other witnesses. If you'd like to elaborate a little bit on that through a question for the record, I will invite that as well. Anyone else seeking to put a question for the record in, you've got a week to do it. We'll try to turn that around and get them to you as quickly as possible so we can get answers back to our members. This has been a very helpful and instructive hearing, and I thank you all for your participation.